What if I told you that weed, the simple green plant many people know for its mellowing effects, has a history filled with secrets, mind-blowing facts, and even moments of rebellion? Join us as we dive deep into the 20 most strange, funny, and insane facts about weed that are sure to leave you amazed. 1. Let's start with something truly wild. Willie Nelson, the iconic country music legend, once smoked a joint right on the roof of the White House. That's right, back in the late 1970s, during the Carter administration, Nelson had a moment of rebellion in one of the most secure buildings in the world. And who was his partner in crime? None other than Chip Carter, the president's own son. For years, this story was treated like a stoner myth, but former President Jimmy Carter himself confirmed it. 2. Nelson isn't the only one to combine weed and spirituality. While most people associate Rastafarians with cannabis use, there's another, lesser-known religious group that incorporates weed into their ceremonies: Hindus. During the Festival of Colors, also known as Holi, many Hindus consume a special drink called Bhang, which contains, you guessed it, cannabis. This tradition has ancient roots, with the story of Lord Shiva himself being linked to the sacred plant. In Hindu mythology, it's said that Shiva, the god of destruction, loved cannabis, and Bhang is a way for devotees to feel closer to him during the celebrations. 3. Let's get scientific for a second. Cannabis has shown promise in treating serious medical conditions like epilepsy. One of the most groundbreaking drugs in this field is called Epidiolex. This medication, made from synthetic cannabis, is used to treat conditions like Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome, which are known to cause life-threatening seizures. 4. Speaking of breakthroughs, here's another interesting fact. Cannabis is sometimes used to treat addiction. That's right, the very plant that some argue could be addictive is also being used to treat addiction to substances like alcohol and opioids. Studies have shown that cannabis can reduce cravings for these substances, making it a potential tool in the fight against addiction. 5. Cannabis isn't always a miracle cure. For people who are genetically predisposed to schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders, cannabis can make things much worse. Multiple studies have shown that cannabis use, especially during adolescence, can increase the risk of developing schizophrenia for those who are genetically vulnerable. 6. Speaking of staying away, Richard Nixon was one of the biggest enemies of cannabis in American history. During his presidency, Nixon launched the infamous War on Drugs, which disproportionately targeted black communities and anti-war activists, many of whom were heavy marijuana users. His administration used marijuana laws as a way to undermine these groups, leading to the mass incarceration of people of color for non-violent cannabis offenses. The damage from these policies is still felt today, as many states struggle with the consequences of unfair marijuana arrests and convictions. 7. Here's a fact that might blow your mind. Why does an edible high feel so different from smoking weed? The answer lies in how your body processes THC. When you smoke weed, THC enters your bloodstream through your lungs, giving you a quicker, lighter high. But when you eat cannabis, your liver converts THC into a stronger form called 11-hydroxy-THC. This compound creates a more intense and longer-lasting high, which is why people often say edibles hit much harder than smoking. 8. Cannabis could survive the apocalypse. That's right, cannabis seeds are safely stored at the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, also known as the Doomsday Vault. Located in the Arctic, this facility houses over 21,500 cannabis seeds from 17 different countries. The idea is to preserve these seeds in case of a global catastrophe, ensuring that cannabis can be regrown even if civilization collapses. 9. Back in the real world, there's a little-known cannabis hero, Mary Jane Rathbun, aka Brownie Mary. In the 1980s, Brownie Mary became famous for baking cannabis-infused brownies and distributing them to AIDS patients in San Francisco. She believed that cannabis helped alleviate their pain and suffering, and her activism played a big role in the push for medical marijuana legalization. Without her efforts, medical cannabis might not be as widespread as it is today. 10. Speaking of wild stories, cannabis grows everywhere in Bhutan, even in the cracks of sidewalks. Despite its abundance, weed is actually illegal in Bhutan, but that hasn't stopped farmers from using it to fatten up their pigs. That's right, in Bhutan, cannabis is often fed to livestock to help them bulk up before being sold. 11. Another bizarre fact, some people are actually allergic to weed. Just like with pollen from flowers, cannabis pollen and smoke can trigger allergic reactions in some people. Symptoms can include sneezing, hives, and even more severe reactions like anaphylaxis. 12. If you're traveling, it's worth knowing where weed is cheapest and most expensive. In 2018, a study revealed that Japan has the priciest cannabis in the world, with a gram costing around $32. On the flip side, the cheapest weed can be found in Quito, Ecuador, where a gram costs just $1.3. That's a huge difference, and it shows how cannabis laws and demand can dramatically affect prices from country to country. 13. Let's take a trip back to 1977, when the US Coast Guard made one of the biggest drug busts in history. Known as the night train seizure, the Coast Guard seized an astonishing 54 tons of marijuana in a single operation off the coast of Florida. This was part of Operation Stopgap, the first ever interagency mission to combat drug trafficking. The seizure was so massive that it made headlines worldwide and marked a turning point in the government's efforts to crack down on the illegal drug trade. 14. In a strange mix-up, some North Carolina hospitals once thought that newborns were testing positive for cannabis. It turns out that certain baby soaps, not secondhand smoke, were causing false positives in their urine tests. For a while, doctors were baffled, thinking that newborns were somehow being exposed to marijuana, but it was really just a soap ingredient creating the confusion. 15. If you think cannabis bans are a new thing, think again. The earliest known anti-cannabis law dates back over 700 years to the 1300s in Arabia. Even Napoleon and the British Empire tried to suppress its use. In fact, the negative reputation of cannabis spread from the Middle East to Europe, leading to a long history of cannabis prohibition worldwide. 16. Here's a fact that might surprise you. Legalizing cannabis could generate $8.5 billion in tax revenue. That's more than the entire organic food market. States that have legalized cannabis are already seeing huge financial benefits from taxing the sale of marijuana, and experts predict that the cannabis market could continue to grow, especially as more states and countries move toward legalization. 17. Speaking of celebrities, did you know that Jaleel White, aka Steve Urkel, has his own cannabis line? That's right, the actor who played the iconic nerd launched a weed brand called It's Purple. He even did ads for it in character, alongside Snoop Dogg. Who would have guessed that Urkel would become a weed mogul? 18. It's not just celebrities like Urkel who have a history with cannabis. Both George W. Bush and Barack Obama admitted to using weed in their younger years. Obama even had a weed-smoking group called the Choom Gang when he was in high school. 19. Speaking of powerful figures, Tupac's friends took their tribute to him to another level. After the legendary rapper's death, his old band, the Outlaws, claimed they mixed some of his ashes with weed and smoked it as a final send-off. While this might sound crazy, it's just another example of how cannabis is intertwined with culture and personal expression. 20. Finally, let's not forget that Washington was the first US state to legalize recreational marijuana. It's fitting, considering George Washington, the first US president, grew hemp on his plantation. Hemp was so important to early America that the first American flag was even made from it. It's a full circle moment in cannabis history. And there you have it. 20 insane facts about weed that you probably never knew. Subscribe to Truth Revealed to stay intrigued and informed.